Hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond GIS. In this episode we're going to look at envisaging new possibilities, particularly in Europe, the inception of the platform in Europe, and sort of look at why does Europe need what we're building. Peter, hello. How are you?
Hi Kurt, good evening again or good morning. Good to see you again. Great, going great here.
Hey, on this episode we're going to look at sort of why the platform, but more with a lens from Europe. Yeah, in your perspective and the team's perspective in Europe. So, we've talked a bit about the platform now. The roadshows are coming out and or will have started, depending on when this episode drops. And they'll be, for the rest of the year, sort of around the world and where Orbica is based. Why? Why Europe?
Yeah, Kurt, it's the typical question, why are we over here? And Europe is one of the biggest single markets in the world nowadays. I think it's either the second or third biggest. So it's a very key market. It's also a market that technology is driven by. There's a huge need for geospatial within the European market. There's lots of global companies as well, companies, organizations that are working with a very large geographic footprint. And so there's a lot of drivers that we see typical for Orbica's customers towards the platform and the cloud native way of operating their geospatial technology. There's also opportunities over here, and we've seen that through the business that Orbica's done in Europe compared to our initial work in New Zealand, that we have a bit more on the enterprise side. So some of our customers, for example, operating globally, looking at, well, if we've got all the locations of our assets, what could a platform like Orbica help us with? And just for one example, I thought, Kurt, was water risk, quite a big topic nowadays, and with the platform. And one of our customers, they've looked at all their manufacturing facilities around the world, and they've said, like, hey, we know all of our locations. What could you tell us? What extra information could location bring us as an enterprise? And we have gone and just with a few days' effort, been able to augment that data or fuse that data with data specific to those locations, water risk, biodiversity risk, that they can then take back and they can understand, where do we focus our attention, where can we make improvements, so that we're not impacting the communities, the local environment of our manufacturing footprint.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, that ties in, right? So if you think about some of the big trends now. Yeah. So if we think about energy, what does energy need to look like in the future, right? Obviously, there's a climate change sort of CO2 angle, methane angle. But then there's still, 400 million-ish in sort of Europe, people-wise.
Yeah, depending on how you measure it.
How you measure it and which countries are in and out. But either way. What always blows my mind when I'm in Europe is the density, right? And what that means both in terms of the efficiency of sort of resource use, but also obviously, how many resources are used. And, I don't know, geospatial just has such an amazing role to play there. And it looks like with our engagement and just the general view of the world, everyone's starting to cotton on to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so too. You also see it from a regulatory perspective, right? We've recently, for example, had a new act come into European Parliament, or where there's anti-deforestation that companies have to adhere to. So that means throughout their supply chain, they have to ensure that there's no deforestation happening. And how do you measure that as an organization if you don't have geospatial or the expertise? How would you find out on your supply chain where that might not be happening? So something like the Orbica platform, we can take satellite imagery. We can look for what are the indicators of deforestation, and we can overlay those with the locations of an organization's supply chain, so we can instantly help them develop proof points that they are adhering to these new regulations.
I mean, supply chain's huge, particularly in Europe, and you only have to look at the fleet of trucks and on the autobahns, right, to sort of understand the scale of it, I guess. I know we're talking to some interesting folks over there. They're looking to have a really big positive impact on supply chain and the movement of stuff, goods around the place. Those guys have figured out pretty quickly, amongst some others, that geospatial is key. And what I find really interesting is in geospatial land, those of us that have done it for so long, so much of this data already exists. Whether it's government-funded data, whether it's ESA satellite data, whether it's OSM, it's incredible, and just opening up the eyes of possibilities to folks that you don't actually have to go and spend another $50 million and collect data. You can get 80% of the way there with openly crowdsourced, crowd-funded, and or other commercial data, but it's really available right now.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. Organizations typically, maybe they're used to working in Excel or some type of BI tool, but they're normally working with their own internal data, right? And then as soon as you open up, you say like, hey, well, let's bring in those locations of your internal sites or your internal business data, and then let's merge that with their existing data you mentioned that's out there, that's open source or that's available, that we might have already derived some insights from. And let's apply that to your business data, and all of a sudden, all of your locations on your key routes, your supply chain, your customers, you can start to understand so much more information. Turning that data into information. I think that you've done a podcast on that before, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No doubt, mingle through a bunch of them. but it's so important. So many folks sit on so many data assets, but again, it's useless, it's pointless if you're not using it, if you're not turning it into something valuable, right? That can put a solution in place to a large business need, a customer need, a stakeholder need. I don't know, it reminds me of that work we did years ago over your way with the containers around the world.
Yeah.
And not only could they look at sort of regulatory or lack of compliance globally in terms of the way freight forwarders were working or not working, but running AI across it could very quickly show consolidation opportunities, right? Why are we running 3 empty containers out of one port on the same ship on the same day? And being able to comb through that data with a geospatial lens was really eye-opening to them.
Yeah, I remember that well. It's these, like you mentioned, the past 5-10 years worth of shipping data sitting from an organization, and all of this is geolocated, and we could quickly optimize. I think, the two things. The compliance is one major thing for organizations. If you've got contracts, you want to make sure that you're fulfilling them, and you can do that by overlaying the location, the routes, and making sure that you're using preferred suppliers, for example, on those routes, so that you're fulfilling contracts. But the other one is the optimization of the route and the consolidation potential. And we saw millions of euros of opportunity per year. It doesn't necessarily mean that the business outcome is that we go and consolidate all containers, but at least we know, hey, what is the opportunity that we have, and then we can look at what is the highest value opportunities for us to potentially consolidate on our supply chain.
I mean, it's the insights it provides, right? I mean, end of the day, it's getting the insights out so you can make an informed decision. I mean, there's other lenses across when and why and how that might happen and how you might enforce decisions or change an enterprise. But first you have to understand the data and the information to make an informed choice, right? If we flip the energy, sitting here whenever I travel back and forth from Europe, but it's a bit of an enigma. On the news last night, it was the first time a French president had visited Germany in 20 years or something. It was a couple of decades. And I want to have that fact checked. But whatever it was, the narrative, at least here on our TV1 or whatever it was, One News over here, that was mind-blowing, because, I mean, you're trained right away. I mean, the political lens must be interesting, right? Particularly with all of the countries that are working cross-border, cross-country, within sort of European Union. And, I mean, you can't argue about geography. You can't argue about supply chain. You can't argue about customers. They are what they are. I don't know. It just must be really interesting to think through and what that means going forward, particularly energy, right? You look at the difference between France and Germany in terms of energy generation and the implications that now means, particularly post, Russia, Ukraine.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Do you have any insights living there where geospatial can really assist with some of the stuff to bring some clarity?
Yeah, I mean, on the energy side, like you mentioned, and I don't know about the political side, Kurt, but there's certainly tensions throughout history in Europe. But I think now more than ever, I mean, you've traveled around and you could go anywhere in Europe, and it really is the single market. You just have to sometimes be able to speak the language. We've been stuck in some of those hotels with Google Translate and had the full-on experience. But yeah, back to the energy side. It's a really interesting and an important topic in Europe because of the conflicts that you mentioned, because of climate change aspects, burning of fossil fuels, because of also Germany deciding to denuclearize their energy network. So there's all types of drivers, and there's also a lot of regulations around where you can put renewable energy sources. So these are all location driven. And we actually have customers both in Germany and France, in the UK, that are looking for, how do we better optimize our site selection? Or what are the risk factors for our site selection? What is, for example, the biodiversity risk if we're going to do a development on that site? Or some organizations are thinking, if we are going to locate wind, first of all, where's the demand? Where are the customers? But then where can we develop wind farms from a regulatory standpoint? Where might be able to, we might be just outside the regulations, and so we might be able to overturn a decision so that we can actually really have a great resource based on, instead of being 1,000 meters from a building, we're 950 meters from a building, and we can use location and maps to prove that the impact is still fairly low. We've spoken about, view shed analysis. So if you're locating a wind farm and you're sort of in a valley, then it doesn't matter as much the distance from a house on the other side of the hill, So there's these types of location aspects that you don't just see from having the regulation.
It's interesting. It's just making me reflect, on the political lens. I guess what I'm sort of trying to describe, I think geography can be the great sort of binding force in a way. If we think about it, we've slapped on these colonial arbitrary boundaries on a map and said, that's France, that's Belgium, that's Holland, that's Switzerland, that's Austria, that's Germany. Geography doesn't care. The flow of CO2 coming out of a coal factory or coal-powered, generator, it doesn't care. There's no arbitrary boundary for the coal or for the smoke or for the methane or the NOxes or, NO2. I guess that's that sort of lens that imagine politicians and those with power getting around a mapping interface with real data and going, oh, yeah, well, that river, okay, it's in France, but it's also in Germany. And if we put stuff in there and vice versa, it's going to have a downstream impact. And it's all connected and we're all sort of one. And I don't know. I just think that's so lost. We have that here in the New Zealand context. We go and put regional council boundaries down the bang down the middle of a river, right, and split the river catchment in half straight away instantly, and then have two different ways of applying policies either side of the river centre line. That's on a microcosm compared to whole country boundaries. I don't know. I see there's so much potential, and there's one globe. We represent that with geography, geospatial data. Surely we can do better, right? And communicate here better and make better informed collective decisions.
Yeah. And I mean, just to emphasize your point as well, these organizations, even if they do want to share information and they do want to work together, sometimes that information, that data is not interoperable. They're using different systems, they're using different data schemas. So there's all types of issues. And we're working on some pretty interesting research as well, Kurt, in the water space over here, flooding. And how do we share information to different organizations about flood risk, especially flash flood risk. We've had some quite international newsworthy events happening in Europe, in Germany as well, of flash flooding causing major losses of infrastructure, of people, of lives. And so how can we better prevent that? How can we better forewarn authorities? And then for the aftermath, how can we share that information better? And it's all about data, making it interoperable, making it collaborative.
I mean, it's such a core principle of what we're building here with the platform. All these years building bespoke projects and the history of myself and yourself and others with, different organizations and different software back in the day. There's two lenses that we've had to tackle this challenge with, right? Around democratisation of geospatial data tooling to remove those barriers. One is technology. So, we need to be able to convert and play with a myriad of formats, There's a couple hundred formats out there. We need to natively be able to support those on ingestion into the platform. But just as importantly, this is where it often gets unstuck with more proprietary providers, is we have to have open APIs, OGT, open standards going back out the other way, right? So very well sucking in a competitor's format, so to speak. But if then you lock them in, and that's your vendor lock-in, you disable everything you're just describing, which is even when an organization, people, agencies are willing, the technology holds them back. And then the other barrier that we've made a decision very early on is, they can do it, sort of, but you need named users, all these bloody enterprise licenses and everything else. So that's the sort of commercial lens. That's not a technology problem. And, we've solved both. We're attempting to solve both. All because we're driven by that democratization aspect, right? And making sure as much of this data gets in the hands of smart people all over the world to solve the challenges that are in front of us.
Yeah, I think that you've really hit the nail on our value proposition there, Kurt. And we've already seen through, giving their initial demos, bringing on the initial foundation customers or migrating existing customers on to the platform, really the power of this value proposition that now, if they want, or if their technology stack is different from the organizations that they're sharing data with, they can now do it very easily from these open APIs. And suddenly we open up all these different areas of collaboration, all these different areas of value for organizations, and huge cost savings, not to mention.
Massive. I mean, it's not just, people always forget there's much more sort of unintended cost. It's not just the direct cost of a license. It's, that team of 6 people I just learned about in Queensland, way up north, not in Brisbane, they got stripped their big heavy desktop licenses. And now they've got workarounds, they're downloading software, but it's not quite working with the network. And now they're back to doing some fancy stuff in Excel and something else. And so it was because of a cost-saving lens that they were stripped their licenses, and they weren't using them that much because they're not GIS analysts. They need to utilize geospatial as part of their job, but they don't spend all day in desktop software. And so now that unintended cost is not 20 grand a license or whatever it is. It's now 5 or 6 people spending many more hours every single week mucking around trying to solve the problem, right? And that's the bit that excites me, because you unlock those tens of hours for them to actually do their real job or innovate or be creative. That's where the magic's going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's a huge aspect. And then, going beyond that, it's unlocking beyond those users as well. The users that are maybe they're not thinking so much about geospatial, but their problem is geospatial at heart, and just through some of their examples that we've been able to bring to organizations, they can see this and they can use the platform. They can use that to help drive their tools. They can bring in their native code, the languages that they want to use, and their front ends that they want to use, whether that be just bringing in some type of BI tool, or whether that be their bespoke front ends that they've developed in-house. So there's all types of opportunities from having this sort of this more open license structure.
I mean, it's the collective minds, I think, that are going to solve a lot of these problems, right? So it's just the enablement to allow these folks to work together in a collaborative way, removing as many of the barriers as possible. I think that's where, again, the magic, where the value will happen, right? Where, GIS isn't a word that people don't know how to spell. Seriously, it's just embedded into people, whether they know it or not. And Google Maps did that amazingly, right? In consumer tech world. And we need that sort of power, that sort of democratized access in enterprisey B2B type world to enable the downstream value to just permeate. Something I've been reflecting on here quite a bit and getting more excited by every day, and I know you guys are too, is if you look at things like in AI land, you look at SAM, the segment anything model, open source released by Meta. There's lots of other stuff out there too, of course. But we can natively just pull that in and interoperate that directly on the platform because of the way it's openly built. And, within no time, ourselves, our users, are like, oh, that's happening on that satellite data, that just like in front of me, in front of my eyeballs. Oh, you mean I don't need to get an extension with a toolbox to get access to what is already open source code and built by a community? That's the lens that people come to realize. It's open source. We should just go for it, people. It works. Get value out of it. Remove the barriers and the constraints.
Yeah, no, you're right. As soon as things like segment anything model came out, ChatGPT or other large language models, these you see lots of organizations, hey, how have we integrated that? Well, with the Orbica platform, you don't really need to integrate it. You just bring the code, and then it's just working. So I think that's the great thing. We can suddenly start to bring in our team here, our developers. They're using a lot of assistance from large language models for their own work, for their own coding as well. So there's a lot of power that these things can bring, and to be able to already enable and use these tools instantly as they come out, because they are evolving constantly. You don't want to be using the things from 3 years ago because they're out of date. And so to be using the most modern technology and tools, which is of course part of the open source community, that's critical and essential.
Yeah, it's so exciting. The power of the open source communities, but backed and orchestrated from an enterprise perspective on an enterprise grade platform that we're building, right? And that ability to get the best of both worlds. Your own platform, your own databases, your own APIs, your full governance and control, security, privacy, access, authentication. But at the same time, you can leverage the latest and greatest. So you're not left behind. And, it's so exciting because, again, in proprietary enterprise land, you're years behind the wave of innovation. And that innovation wave is just doing this right now because of LLMs and everything else happening. So, again, as GIS professionals, we need to be on top of this, because very quickly we can have a big role if we do this right, helping the world understands geospatial and everything we know as a sector and have learned, but in a new and modern and scalable way, rather than us being overtaken and becoming irrelevant. And we're not the only sector, of course, but it's obviously the one we're passionate about. So we were trying to have a big impact. Yeah.
I completely agree there, Kurt. Yeah. I'm just so excited by the opportunity here. We're really, I think, at the beginning of a new phase for Orbica, and there's just so much more to come.
Hey, look, as we look to sort of wrap this up, and this has been really interesting, let's sort of bring it back specifically, let's finish up back in Europe. What sort of projects with the folks you're both talking to bring them on as customers, but also existing customers, which are the ones that are really exciting you and the team at the moment? I mean, geospatial so broad, it can help so many sectors, but sort of where are you guys sort of focused generally at the moment, where you can have a really cool, positive impact?
Well, there's a few. I mean, we've got, like you mentioned, Kurt, their existing customers, and being able to bring now to these customers a full-on platform. They know Orbica, they know things that we can do. Their applications are already running in the platform, and now they can sort of start to see like, hey, actually, just for example, one of their customers that we were speaking to yesterday, they have a software as a service running in the platform. So now they can start to say, actually we can provide a new API, and that's a new area of business for us. And that's just instantly out of the platform. We don't have to develop something new. They can now sell a new form of their product straight away. So there's all types of exciting new opportunities there. Some of our bigger customers, for example, one of the biggest wastewater utilities in Europe, I think that they mentioned the other day, and bringing to them a platform where they can start to migrate from their traditional desktop GIS, geospatial, into this new cloud native form. So those are just a couple of the exciting things. I mean, when you were over here, the conversations we had with the insurance industry were pretty amazing, and they're carrying on. And there's some huge opportunities there for insurance to leverage the power.
I mean, just on that note, right? It's and just particularly for the listeners, it's built in such a way that you can start with a project or two, and actually just get going and add value fast to the business, your customers, your stakeholders. It's not the big scary, here's my switch off date between two big ELAs or version upgrades or whatever they might look like. And so that hybrid approach is so important, I think. And as we're seeing, it happens quite fast, but just for customers, it's not turn off your traditional embedded workflows. Let's slowly, bit by bit, modernize those and bring those into the next century, or actually, even more importantly, find net new value in the business for your customers, where geospatial GIS hasn't got to yet, for whatever reasons that might be. Jargon, licenses, lack of people, lack of personnel, whatever they might look like. So I think it's really important for listeners, to the point where it's just open services. Like, as we do, just consume it directly into desktop products. QGIS, Esri, it doesn't matter. You can get the value of the cloud at the same time as not disrupting some of your desktop processes. I guess the point is, it doesn't need to be all things to all people. You grow the value, it finds its value, and you sort of roll with it in a cloud native way as it should be.
Yeah, no, that's right. And the customers, or organizations, we've seen it fail so many times, these big technology migrations. Yeah. But the way that we try to bring to organizations exactly like what you say, incremental, and this is really the way to go nowadays with migrations, bringing in new technology.
100%. How do you de-risk things? How do you increase time to value? How do you move the needle from an innovation lens? And how do you keep up with the world that's changing so fast? It's not spending 5 years on a migration. By the time you've migrated, it's completely out of date anyway, because it was spec 5 years ago. We don't live in that world anymore, and we shouldn't. We need to be smarter, I think, about some of the decisions we make around this stuff. And integration is key, because there's no one technology stack that solves all of a business's problems. It's how they interplay and connect together nicely, which is going to allow organizations to move forward.
Yes, 100%, Kurt.
Hey, thanks, Peter. It's been another awesome episode. Thanks, listeners, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Beyond GIS. Cheers.
Thanks, Kurt.